Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Walters, and I'm here to talk to you today, this afternoon, about the importance of mitigation. I bring to that subject a particular perspective. I've had a career as a commercial trial lawyer, but I've handled a couple death penalty cases along the way, and bring that perspective to this question that we'll discuss today. Before getting into the importance of mitigation, we should ask ourselves or remind ourselves, what is mitigation? After all, most jurors, when given that word, have no understanding, probably, of what it means. It's synonymous with mitigating evidence, that is, evidence that's offered in a trial, criminal trial, by the defense in order to try to seek a lesser sentence for the offender, their client. But actually, mitigation evidence, it doesn't have boundaries. It can be anything, really anything that reflects positively on the offender. And when I say anything, I'll give you a few examples. But first, I'll say the Supreme Court 50 years ago in Lockett said that mitigating evidence was any aspect of the defendant's character or record that is offered by his defense team to get a lesser sentence. Any aspect. And anything is reflected in the cases that have been printed from the appellate courts. I'll give you a few examples of how wide-ranging mitigating evidence has proved to be, not only has been, but has effectively been. In one case, the defendant got a lesser sentence because of his efforts to nurse his sister through an incapacitating stroke that she had suffered. In another case, the court found evidence that this offender had been a kind man, a decent person, a dependable employee, a family man, and that was enough to convince the court that a lesser sentence was justified. In another case, the effective mitigating evidence was that the defendant had a very good military record before the crime. And then one other example, just to show you how broad mitigating evidence can effectively be. Another offender got a lesser sentence. I think his death sentence was lifted because he had nursed his mother through a terminal illness, washing her hair, shopping for her, changing her catheter even. This convinced the court that this man should not be given a death sentence. Now, those are the examples, and now I want to tell you why mitigation, to me, is so important. There are three reasons. First, it can be found as a practical matter. It's not an impossibility. It can be found. Second, it works. And third, when it works, it produces in our criminal justice system a fairer sentence, a sentence which can fairly be called a just sentence for the offender. And that's the purpose of our criminal work. Let me tell you then about these three. First, I said that it can be found. Yes, it can be found. But that's the work of ARC. ARC's work is to find mitigating evidence. It's a hard thing to do, but it can be found. Two main aspects to this, perhaps. First, ARC has to send into the field investigators, specialists in mitigation, to find and interview witnesses who knew the offender and are willing to say positive things about that person. Another key part of the work is the hard work back in the office by the records specialists at ARC, who seek all manner of records about the life of the offender before the crime, and even prison conduct after the crime. Records don't lie. They can be exceedingly important in these cases. So mitigation evidence can be found. Secondly, we know it works. Why do we know it works? Here's two examples from where mitigating evidence actually changed the sentence, lessened the sentence, in two of the most horrific multiple murder crimes in American history. First, some will remember the Oklahoma City bombing case, where Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols conspired and plotted and executed a plan that blew up a federal building, killing 250 some people, as I recall, including many children. McVeigh was executed. But when Terry Nichols came on for trial, his lawyer, Ira Tiger, was able to find and present compelling mitigation evidence as to why his client should not be executed. And Nichols received a life sentence. An amazing demonstration of the power of mitigation and how it works. Another outstanding example, 9/11. Okay, there you have, 11 Saudi killers in the airplanes that crashed into the World Trade Center and crashed into the Pentagon, killing 3,000 plus people. Yet there was a 12th killer, Musawi, Saudi, who missed the taxi cab or whatever happened. He was not on the planes. He was then apprehended nonetheless and tried for the 9/11 massacres. The mitigating evidence was presented on his behalf, and believe it or not, he received a life sentence, to the amazement of many. But the fact that mitigation works was really brought home to me in my own personal experience by a case I handled for many years in Pennsylvania for Bradley Martin. He had been convicted and sentenced to death in Pennsylvania, along with his girlfriend. Now, Martin was a young Caucasian man. His girlfriend was an African-American woman. And here's the crime. The two of them went in to seek a loan, not from a bank. They went to see a friend of my client's, Guy Goodman. Guy was a very interesting man. He was a gay man. And when he was asked for a loan by these two, he started putting his arms around Brad and trying to kiss him and fondle him and so forth. And all hell broke loose. Brad grabbed the nearest thing available, a Chinese vase, hit Mr. Goodman over the head with it, knocked him out. They tied him up and gagged him brutally and took him to the basement, tied him up, and left him to die, which he did. These two then took a stolen car across the country like Bonnie and Clyde. They ended up going to South Dakota, Idaho, California, finally apprehended in a high-speed chase in Arizona. They were apprehended and brought back to Pennsylvania for trial. And after they were tried and convicted and sentenced to death by the jury, so sensational was the case here in Pennsylvania that the trial judge, Judge Eby, thought he should speak to the media after the verdicts were in. And he said, if ever there was a case deserving of the death penalty, this was it. That was the judge's view. But Judge Eby had not heard any mitigating evidence. A group of us representing Brad Martin came in and asked for a hearing to present the mitigating evidence. And finally, the judge agreed to give us a hearing, basically saying, look, if you have any mitigating evidence, you better put up or shut up. He gave us 5 days to present it. It took us 5 days. We had lots of mitigating evidence. The evidence included that, unbeknownst to the jury and judge, Bradley Martin had been the victim of sexual abuse when he was growing up at the hands of his older uncle. He had then been sent to a rehab facility where he was brutally beaten and forced to, quote, confess to these sexual abuses he had suffered. Ultimately, this caused him to be mentally ill. He developed 2 Axis I major mental illnesses at the time of the crime. The jury and judge had never heard any of this. And this mitigating evidence not only was helpful in sentencing of Brad Martin, but it tended to explain the reason for the murder. After all, the victim here, Guy Goodman, was an older man who tried to come on sexually to Brad Martin, who had sworn that he would never let an older man do this to him again. And so when it occurred, Brad had a PTSD flashback, is what they call it, back to the sexual abuses by the uncle. He lost his mind, basically. And that's why it was a Chinese vase nearby that he actually grabbed and carried out the crime. But all this led Judge Eby, despite his previous speaking of the case to the press, he ultimately struck down the death penalty for Brad Martin and sentenced him to life. So, to summarize, it worked. The mitigating evidence worked. And as I've said, it can be found. And it works. And when it does, it produces what we all want, which is a fair and just sentence for the particular offender who carried out the crime. I just want to say a word here in conclusion to thank ARC and Liz Varkesia and all others at ARC for the great work they do. They need all the help they can get. But it's been my pleasure to speak to you this afternoon about the importance of mitigation. Thank you.